Okay, we're on Mem Zayin Amid Beis. We're by the middle of the daf, more or less, the two dots. So now we're going to start a different part of the Mishnah to discuss about Kinyan. And it's by the two dots. It says Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So we've referred to this Rabbi Yochanan many times already, because Rabbi Yochanan was the one who says, and he disputes with Rav Shlokish, but Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says, Devar Torah mos koinus. So we've had this discussion now for weeks and weeks. And we know that from our original discussion of the Mishnah on Mem Daled, that when you do a transaction with money and a chayfetz and an object, then the chayfetz is what has to be mekabel kinyan, not the money. Okay, that was the standard. So if someone gives you money, then you have the person then has to take the chayfetz and make a kinyan. If he doesn't make a kinyan, the deal isn't done. And the deal is not done just because the seller has the money doesn't make the kinyan, doesn't make the deal. And we're going to go into depth on that this morning. So the kinyan has to come from the chayfetz, not the money. Comes Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was the Gadol Ador, and he was in every respect the Tana. Devar Torah mos konos. No, it's min haTorah that money is konen. That money actually seals the transaction, unlike everything we've been saying. And we've referred to this Rabbi Yochanan many times. Why do we have a rabbinic decision subsequent to that? Says Rabbi Yochanan, why then do we say that you have to have Mashiach to be Kona? In other words, the buyer has to take the chayfetz b'Mashiach or Hakbo, whatever it happens to be, but Mashiach is the more likely one. Why does that have to happen? Says the Gemara, Gezerah Shema Yomalo Nisru Chatecha Ba'aliyah. No, in other words, we've said that before, that we're afraid that if the seller is kind of just by getting the money, then he will disregard the chayfetz, which he still has in his possession because the buyer did not make the kinyan, right? He didn't make a kinyan yet. And because of that, if something happens where that chayfetz gets burnt or a wild animal consumes it or who knows what, then he'll say, I'm sorry, it's not my responsibility. You should have taken it. You didn't take it. Your loss. So Chazal, the Rabbanan, came and said, in order to prevent that from happening, therefore, money alone is not going to make the kinyan. The kinyan has to be completed by the person taking the chayfetz into his reshus, and therefore, if something happens in the buyer's reshus, okay, fine. I mean, you took the chayfetz and it got burnt, but it's not the seller's fault. So that's the theory behind Rabbi Yochanan. Midaraisa mos konos, midrabanan, you need Mashiach in order to protect the buyer. And we're going to see in a minute, it's not just the buyer who you're protecting, interestingly enough, because we're saying, oh, we're protecting the buyer because maybe something will happen to the chayfetz while it's in the reshus of the seller, and that makes sense, but it's more than that. We'll see in a minute.
But the chayfetz has to be metaltalin, right? Not karka.
All right, it's a very important point, Jay. That the chayfetz here is a metaltalin. It's a movable object that can be kind of b'mashicha or hagbah, but mashicha again we're saying. So in other words, it's something that can be easily kona by just taking it, pulling it, taking it. However, okay. So having said that, let's take a look at the Gemara here. Okay, so now let's take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi says v'ozar of Yochanan Tamei. With Ukal Rabbi Shmuel, the pligi I called over she'ein aliyah. Oh no, sorry, that's the previous. Okay, fine. So there's no Rashi here right now. So we're going to go a little bit weiter. So now, because that's the point of Rabbi Yochanan, and now the essence of our discussion this morning is going to be a back and forth between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish to understand both of their views. And as is typical in the Gemara, which we've seen, when we explain one view, then the Gemara always asks, what does the other man d'Amar do with Rabbi Yochanan's view? In other words, once we establish Rabbi Yochanan's view, we understand it, then we say Rabbi Shlakish, then we're going to see the Gemara is going to ask, well, Rabbi Yochanan makes sense. Why doesn't Rabbi Shlakish agree with him? The Gemara is going to tell us. Then there's Gemara going to go back and say, well, Rabbi Shlakish makes sense. Why doesn't Rabbi Yochanan agree with him? And that's the format of many Gemaras, where in order to get to the essence of the underlying concept, we go back and forth and we press one to understand his view and why he doesn't agree with the other view. It's not enough to say, I hold it's d'Rabbanan. Why don't you hold it's d'Oraisa? In other words, the Gemara really plumbs that depth often to understand what's the real shita of the various man d'Amrim. Okay. So we've given an explanation. So Frek the Gemara. So now the Gemara is going to ask a kasha on this explanation that we just gave, that Rabbi Yochanan says it's d'Oraisa, but we're protecting the buyer. Sof man d'shad deleka boy shlume. What's the problem here? If there's a fire and the fire is set by someone, he's chayiv. So why are we worrying that it's the seller who's going to basically so to speak sell out the buyer by not protecting his chayfetz? If someone lights a fire, let's say the third person, Levi, he comes along and he sets a fire. If he sets a fire, he's chayiv. Why are we worrying about the seller to protect the buyer? We have a culprit. We have a guilty party, the third person, Levi, and let Levi be mechuyev. So that's the Gemara's kasha. Sof, man d'shada deleka boy shlume. The one who lights the fire should be responsible. So why are we pinning this responsibility on the seller? Let's look at it the way we should. The person who lights the fire is chayiv, and therefore the seller is not going to be on the hook for anything. Effort the Gemara. So the Gemara says, okay, that's a very good answer. Okay, that's good if you actually have a culprit. You have someone who lit a fire. What happens if there's an accidental fire and you can't pin it at anybody? Who's going to protect the buyer? Therefore, we're back to square one and saying the seller has to protect the buyer. He's the only one who can. Because how? By our saying that we require the buyer to make a kinyan so that we can truly say the buyer owns it in every respect. And therefore, if it's a fire, then Mr. Buyer, you're responsible. We're not going to pin it on the seller if you make a kinyan. But if you don't make
O'Leary's cow.
What's that?
Mrs. O'Leary's cow. Burned down, what was it? Burned down half of Chicago or something?
Right. Right. So it's really a question of who you're going to put the onus on. And the logic here is that it's the seller who is in control because the chayfetz is in his rishus. Even though the buyer was, let's say, I won't say negligent, but he delayed. He said, look, I've got to be out of town. There's no way I can make a meshicha on this thing. My daughter's having a baby. I've got to be in Eretz Yisrael, whatever. So you hold it for me. Hold it for me. I'm agreeing to buy it. Here's the money, but I got to leave town quickly. So, and again, that's not an unusual situation where he just can't get to the chayfetz to make the kinyan. Says Rabbi Yochanan, even though midoraisa, it's over, the kinyan has the deal has been struck, but in order to protect the buyer, the Rabbanan said we've got to do something to protect him, and what we're going to do is we're going to say that the seller is the one who is most likely in a position to help. Okay.
Could the buyer have called a shliach from the airport and said go over and finish it?
You know that's a good answer. So he can hire a shliach.
Yeah.
But you know, Jay, it's interesting. He can do that, but we don't force him to do it so that we don't say because he didn't do it, therefore he gives up the right of ownership and he's responsible. Interestingly, we don't say that. Right. But you're right. It's simple enough for him to hire a shliach and take it, and therefore he'll be protected. But we don't penalize him for not doing it. That's really what the Gemara is trying to tell us, is that he has a right to do it, but if he doesn't do it, okay, fine. So he didn't do it. All right. Okay. So that's the teretz. The teretz is that we have to protect him from an accident, not from someone who actually makes the who makes it, but from an accident. Okay. Now So the Gemara now says, okay, the ilo mosa nafshe torach umatzel. Okay, so now the Gemara is saying, then if you, following up on what we said, so if the merchandise, the chayfetz, is in the possession of the seller, then mosa nafshe torach umatzel, he'll extend himself. Why? Because there's another motive. See, the motive isn't just to help the buyer. The motive is that the chayfetz, let's say, was a commodity that goes up and down in price. So the seller will have an incentive to protect the chayfetz, because if it goes up in price, the seller, can benefit from the appreciation, because since it's in his possession, he can say, you know what, I'm going to cancel this. In other words, as long as it's not a final sale, he can say, I'm going to cancel the sale. Okay, it's in my possession. You didn't take it. I'm canceling the sale. The chayfetz is now worth 50% more than when I sold it to you. So there is an incentive, says the Gemara, for the seller to protect it, because we're allowing him the leeway to say, I want to pull back because you didn't make a kinyan, and therefore I want to take it back. And the Gemara is, we're allowing him to do it under Rabbi Yochanan so that he has an incentive to protect it. You see how it's a chap, because if it's just a question of protecting it from the buyer's standpoint, okay, fine, then okay, we're going to say that he has an incentive to protect it because the rabbis say that it's not yet a completed deal. But if you flip the switch and you say it's not just to protect the buyer, it's to incentivize the seller, that the seller may benefit from an appreciation in price if the buyer hasn't made a kinyan. Now we're talking. Now the seller is saying, okay, I have a vested interest. I'm not just protecting my friend. I have a vested interest in this chayfetz because this chayfetz may appreciate on my watch, as long as the buyer didn't make the kinyan. So that's
what about the other way around? What about the other way around? If the item depreciated, and all right,
but if it depreciated, he doesn't have to pull the trigger and say I'm taking it back. In other words,
right? But could the buyer now turn around and say,
no? The buyer doesn't have that schus. The seller has that schus, and if the seller has the schus, then he's going to monitor the chayfetz, and if it's in his interest, he'll pull it back. If it's not in his interest, he'll say, we're just babysitting it until you come back. And the buyer does not have the option of pulling back because he already gave the money. So the whole question is, he gave the money, and we're saying, okay, you gave the money, but the transaction isn't complete. But you can't renege. You already gave the money. So you can't renege. You just have to make a kinyan. And we're waiting, and we'll give you the benefit of the doubt, and we'll let you make the kinyan when you're ready. Okay, fine. It may take a little bit. But from the seller's standpoint, he has an added incentive because he now has the chayfetz. He has he made a kinyan. I mean, so to speak, he made a kinyan by taking the money and Mos Konos. But since midrabanan, you still don't have a deal,
right?
So he's in that no man's land where he has the best of all worlds. I have a deal, but I can have a better deal if it appreciates. Then I have a better deal. Okay, so that is the chap here that the Gemara wants to tell us why we're incentivizing, according to Rabbi Yochanan only, why we're incentivizing him that Mos Konos, but still he holds in the balance the opportunity to cancel the deal or not, depending on what the circumstances with the chayfetz. And again, so he has to protect it, but he's not only protecting it for the buyer's benefit, he's protecting it for his own benefit. Because if this is a commodity, he can really see the uptick in price. Of course he'll protect it from his own standpoint. Why shouldn't he protect it? He will benefit. Okay, so that's kind of how we shape Rabbi Yochanan. So now, we understand Rabbi Yochanan. Now the Gemara is going to come along and is going to open up to us and explain to us his bar machlokes, Rosh Lakish. Okay, now so let's take a look. Rosh Lakish Omer, right? Okay, a little bit further down, Rosh Lakish says, Meshicha mufareshes min haTorah. No. The Meshicha, the Kinyan, is beferish in the Torah, that's what you have to do, not Mos. You have to do Meshicha, which, by the way, fits into everything we've said since the beginning of learning this whole sugya, is that the Chayfetz has to be Koneh. And that's, how do you do that? Again, Meshicha is the example, but most of them are with Meshicha. Okay. My Talmud Rosh Lakish, says the Gemara, what's the reason of Rosh Lakish that he says that? Omakra. Okay, so here we go, because we see there's a pasuk in the Torah, and what does the pasuk say? The pasuk is in Vayikra. Okay, and so there in Vayikra, the whole inyan there is v'chisimkru mimkal amisecha okona miyad amisecha. You have to pay special attention to the words, because the words are important. So what does the pasuk say? If you're going to make a sale to your lamisecha, to your friend, okono miyad amisecha, or you're going to buy it miyad, from the hand of your friend. To your point, Jay, and we'll see in a minute that this has to be metaltalin. That's the upshot of why it says miyad, because you can't transfer land miyad, right? You can't. Land is not a fungible item that you can transfer from my hand to your hand, so it has to be talking about metaltalin. Okay, so since we have that pasuk, and that pasuk forewarns that you can't that when you sell something to your friend, right, or buy something from your friend, you have to be scrupulous and not do something improper, not commit a fraudulent act. Like we said, remember we talked about a sheish. If you oversell it by a sixth or undersell it by a sixth, these are all in yonim that have to do from this pasuk, that you have to be honest. Now, we're not talking about an accident. If you came to me and said, how much for this? I have no clue, and I say $20. Okay, nothing intentional. I say $20. Just so happens it's only worth 10, and I'm way over in my pricing, right? More than a sixth. So as the Gemara says, that if you're over a sixth, then you have to pay back that sixth, right? But here we're talking accidental. We're not talking intentional. Okay.
Yeah, another way that happens, I just saw something about this recently. It happens every so often with things that turn out, somebody thinks it's a common item, and some collector comes along and thinks, aha, I know that thing. That's really probably something that's worth, thousands or even millions,
right,
and goes ahead and buys it real cheap without saying a word. And then, a month later it's on sale. So it's some big auction house for $1 million. And there are lawsuits sometimes from this, that the person should have said something,
Right. So look, so this whole inyan, of course, has to do with mazid. I mean, if a person doesn't know, he doesn't know. He's b'shogeg. He says, and by the way, this could be an inyan for a Jewish pawnbroker, because pawnbrokers notoriously, I mean, they try to be fair, but they're certainly being fair to more to themselves. So they'll look at an item and they say, "Oh, this is worth $100." Oh, really? It's worth $100? I thought only 50, so I'm happy to buy it. He knows it's $500, but he's saying $100. So there, someone who's a Jewish pawnbroker, and he does that, and he has an understanding of what he's doing. He's over on he's over on this lav of overcharging more than a sixth. Again, we have to pick his brain and understand what did he know, and what did he intend. But that's the inyan. So because of this pasuk, so this is Rosh Lakish now. What do we learn from this? Davar hanikna miyad liyad. So we are talking about something that is sold from hand to hand. What is hand to hand? It's like Jay said, we have to be talking about metaltalin. So now we're talking about metaltalin that is sold from hand to hand, right? And this is a pasuk in the Torah, says Rosh Lakish. How do you make a kinyan on something that is sold from hand to hand? You pick it up, or you pull it, or whatever it is. So from here we see Mishicha midaraisa, that the kinyan of Mashicha is midaraisa because of this pasuk that the Torah says, Davar hanikna miyad liyad, and the only way to do that is to pull it, pick it up, push it, whatever. But in that genre of Mashiach, as I said, could be Hagbah, but in the genre of Mashiach, we see Mida Oraisa. So Rosh Lakish has a very, very strong basis for disputing Rabbi Yochanan and saying Mashiach is Mida Oraisa. So if Mashiach is Mida Oraisa, then we have to wait for the buyer to make his Mashiach, because that's the only way the transaction can be completed, is if you do what the Torah says, i.e. Mashiach. So that's the basis of the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rosh Lakish, is how you learn pshat in the Torah. According to Rabbi Yochanan, no, it says Mo's Konos, and Rosh Lakish disputes, and he says, no, there's a Beferish Pasuk. Now we're going to try to reconcile and understand this. We're going to go back and forth now that I said, what does Rabbi Yochanan say about this? What does Rosh Lakish say about this? But basically, that's now, we've set the stage for the machlokes. So the time is, okay, fine. So now we've established what the basis of the machlokes is. Now goes the Gemara weiter. Says the Gemara, the Rabbi Yochanan. So the kasha says, so what does Rabbi Yochanan do with this pasuk? This is a wonderful pasuk, right? It shows that you have to do Mashiach. How does Rabbi Yochanan learn that? What's his defense, Rabbi Yochanan, to Rosh Lakish's position? Seems like a very, very solid position. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, miyad lemu'ute karka, the less bay oino'o. So this now goes back again to the very beginning, where Jay said we have to be talking about metaltalin. So Rabbi Yochanan says, you know what? This pasuk comes to exclude karka, because you can't use karka miyad liyad. I can't transfer. Now, in theory, if we really wanted to express ourselves, we would say, well, he has a shtar. He has a document that he owns the land. So, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about a shtar where he owns the land, where you can say transfer the shtar. We're talking about the land itself. What can you do with this land? You can't make Mashiach on land, right? So says Rabbi Yochanan that, you know what this pasuk tells me? Not that Mashiach is midoraisa. What tells me, the mute karka, the less may I know, that there is no ono on karka. That's how he interprets it. What does that mean? That if I have a piece of land and I say, you know what, I'll sell you this land for $1,000, and you say, okay, $1,000 is a lot of money, but I'll buy it, and it turns out the land is only worth $500. So l'chayra, you're going to say that there is ono, that there is this whole inyan of a sixth, and there has to be payment. Says Rabbi Yochanan, this pasuk tells us there is no oino by karka. That's how he learns pshat in this pasuk, so that he doesn't have to answer. It says Mashiach midaraisa. Why do you say that you can buy something and make a kinyan for money? We see you have to have Mashiach. No, that pasuk Mashiach has nothing to do with the buying. It has to do to exclude you from oino, right? And again, this is the way the Gemara approaches the sugya. Go ahead, Jay.
I know that you can't do Mashiach on land, but they could have set up a ceremony where the new buyer takes with a shovel and he digs a hole. The fact that he digs a hole, it had to be his property, and that's another way of the equivalent of Mashiach. Why can't something like
no, you're absolutely right. But he has to do something, as opposed to just saying, okay, it's mine now.
No, so he does something. So
if he does something, then you have a kinyan. You're 100% right. We know from our previous Gemara, you can put up a fence, right? Remember, we talked about how do you make a kinyan on karka? You put up a fence, you move some stones. You're right, 100%. As long as you do a physical act to show kinyan, but you can't do it miyad liyad. In other words, a handshake won't do it. Right? The piece of paper alone isn't going to do it. There has to be accompanied with something physical. You're 100% right. If it's physical, then we have a kinyan. But according to this pasuk, we see that Mashiach works for metaltalim, and Rabbi Yochanan says, but it doesn't work for karka. So what do I do with the pasuk? The pasuk gives me another reason to understand that by land, you can't just have, there's no I know. There's no such thing as I know by land. By land, someone has to scout it out, has to understand what the value of the land is, and make his deal accordingly. And you can't fall back later and say, oh, wait a minute, I overpaid, right? That won't work.
Well, why couldn't the definition of Mashiach include doing something with a shovel?
Yes, exactly. It does, but Mashiach, the way we understand Mashiach from the pasuk, it says miyad liyad. The Mashiach that we understand is miyad liyad is something that doesn't apply to karka. You're right. The equivalent of miyad liyad to karka is digging a hole, putting up a fence, something else. But in the literal translation, miyad liyad, it doesn't apply.
Okay.
The word miyad. So you're going to ask a kasha. The Torah says miyad. Maybe it doesn't mean miyad. Maybe it means digging a hole. But it says miyad. In other words, always in the Torah, when we learn the Torah, at first blush, interpret the Torah the way it's written. Don't learn pshat. In other words, the Torah says miyad liyad. It means miyad liyad. Now, then you start plumbing the depths. So miyad liyad on its face means Mashiach miyad liyad. Okay, right. Now we go in, we say, but you can't do that by karka and a chanami. Therefore, we have to find something else that is the equivalent, but not miyad liyad. So we say it's digging a hole, putting up a fence, doing something, a siman on the karka that you did it, that it's yours. But by going by and just looking at it and waving and say, okay, this is now my land, that's not a kinyan. That's not a kinyan. Okay. So that's pshat in Rabbi Yochanan. Now the Gemara is going to ask a kasha. Wait a minute, Rabbi Yochanan, you gave us a beautiful answer by saying that there's no oino. Rav Shlokish, why can't you agree to that? So now we're going to go back to Rav Shlokish, and we're going to say, Rav Shlokish, you said that there has to be Mashiach. What about Rabbi Yochanan's explanation? Rabbi Yochanan gave a wonderful explanation, and he said that since you have to have miyad liyad, it doesn't apply to karka. So we're gonna say that there's no oino by karka. Why don't you say the same thing? This is what I mean by going back and forth. We're going to understand what's Rav Shlokish's reasoning, why he doesn't say the same thing as Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says, Rav Shlokish, what about Rav Shlokish? Why doesn't he agree? So he says, in Kain, Lichtev Kro, Miyad Amisecha Al Tonu. In other words, the words of the pasuk. So let's look at the words of the pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'chisimkaru mimkal amisecha." If you're going to sell something to your friend, okono miyad amisecha, or you're going to buy it something from your friend, then it says, "Altonu, don't deceive him." Altonu, don't deceive him. That's the pasuk. So Rav Shlokish says, if I agree, and we agree that Rabbi Yochanan is correct, then why did the pasuk say "V'sisimcharu mimkar miyad amisecha"? It should have said, "Altonu okono lomali." Why do we need the extra words okana? In other words, there's a reciprocal event here, right? I shouldn't cheat you, and you shouldn't cheat me. Okana miyad amisecha, meaning that the person who's buying from his friend should also not be cheated. So it's a reciprocal thing the Torah is telling us, not just one-sided. I can cheat you, I shouldn't cheat you, but you can cheat me. Says the Torah, no. So the Gemara is saying, if we're going to learn like Rabbi Yochanan, then it's enough to say, "V'simcha mimkar miyad amisecha al tonu." Don't do it. Why? Because he says, Rabbi Yochanan says that karka is the less be'ano, and that's how we're learning out. That if that's what we're learning out, then let's just simply say that if a moicher sells to a buyer, and that he shouldn't cheat the buyer. He shouldn't cheat the buyer. We're not worried about the reciprocal, because the reciprocal, if he sells in the karka or something, then there's not going to be any cheating going on, because at that point it's a whole different Metzias according to Rabbi Yochanan on the receiving end. So why does it say okana? It should just say altonu. It says Rav Shlokish, shma mina l'mashicha. Therefore, what I learned from him saying economy misecha is that those extra words that the Torah says has to be mishicha. So again, Rav Lakish is saying that on its face value, if I only, so Rav Lakish is agreeing. If the pasuk said v'chi simkeru mimkar miyada misecha, that if you sell something, right, you make a mechira, and miyada misecha, from the hand of your friend, altonu, don't cheat him, okay? Don't do anything improper. Okay, that's enough. Rish Lakish says that alone would cover every eventuality. It's not that it only goes one way. It says miyad amisecha. It would also include a seller to a buyer and a buyer to a seller. It would go both ways. So by having the word okana, there is an extra word here. Shema mina l'mashicha. So according to Rish Lakish, that extra word is what determines and tells us that Mashiach is midaraisa. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't learn it that way. Rabbi Yochanan learns it that the word, the extra word, miyad lemute karka. He is saying that it excludes karka. The karka can't be, you can't sell with Mashiach. Rish Lakish says, no, it doesn't. What has to do with karka? A sale miyad misecha goes from buyer to seller, seller to buyer. And the word okana means Mashiach. So again, we have a fundamental difference in the way Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish look at the pasuk, and therefore each one is latamei as to what the reason is why either you say that Mashiach is midaraisa or Mashiach is not. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it doesn't come into question Mashiach is midaraisa, because we need every word of the pasuk to explain something that is excluded. In the case of karka, is that there's no ono. Rav Lakish says no, that has nothing to do with it. Now, again, the question is, according to Rav Lakish, is there ono on karka? And that's a good question, which I'd have to think about and look further. But he's saying it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because we don't have to learn it from the pasuk. So mistama, I would have to imagine that he agrees there's no ono on karka, but we don't need a pasuk for it. But I'll take a look just to be double sure what Rish Lakish's position is on that point. So now let's take a look at Rashi. Lemute karka ba'ona, the shtoi bekra, also the kiven the ena nikches miyad liad ein ba'ona. So now the rule is now going to be established that only when something is transferred miyad liyad is there ono. So according to this, Rish Lakish would say there is no ono either. There is no ono. Why? Because according to this pasuk, only something that is transferred miyad liyad can create ono. If it's not miyad liyad, then the whole parsha of ono doesn't apply. That's what it seems from this pasuk. Okay, and maybe it makes sense. Maybe it makes sense is because metaltalin is something that you and I mean, it's not as easy to define value on metaltalin as a karka, right? Karka is something that is stable. It's there. You know, you can go to the courthouse. You can look at sales. In other words, there's something about karka that makes it easier to establish a price because it's not fungible. It's not something that, you know, you can take with you, maybe, you know, put it away in a safe deposit box. It'll appreciate in price. Karka is karka. It's out in the open. Everybody knows what karka is. I think that's the theory why there's no ono by karka, is because karka is something that's much easier to assess value, right? Again, there's public records, there's documents, so therefore there's no ono by karka because it's more public. Whereas metaltalin, which has, you know, maybe there's something going on that I don't know about, that this particular item has appreciated in value because who knows? It's become scarce in the, you know, out there. Things that I might not know, or things that I couldn't research publicly and know that there is a reason why the price is what it is. There, we, meaning the olam, is protecting the buyer and the seller by saying that there is such a thing as I know, because a person may not know, and if he doesn't know, you can't cheat him. You can't just go ahead and cheat him. So I think theoretically we can understand the difference between karka, which is public in the records and everybody knows, or metaltalin, which is not something easily, discernible what the price is, because there may be a market for it that I'm not aware. Someone's willing to buy that for more money. And again, that's why a pawnbroker who's supposed to have a general knowledge of merchandise, that's why you go to him, because l'chayra, I'm saying l'chayra, he can evaluate it and give you a fair price. So if it's not fair, then he is chayiv on the isser of oino, and he has to make good. All right, so that's what Rashi is telling us. Lamute karka ma'ono, because
nowadays with karka, you have no idea that the price might be going up, and somebody knew about a planning board's notion of changing the arrangement,
zoning or something. Right.
Lots of hidden things with karka today that you wouldn't know.
Right, but the theory is, Jay, I think that you may not know, I may not know, but with a little bit of homework, we can find out what's in the wind, because karka is public. In other words, you can kick the tire, you can kick the dirt, as opposed to a metaltalin, which is more hidden. In other words, so psychologically, there is a difference between a metaltalin, which is in the private domain, and karka, which is in the public domain. You're 100% right. If I don't know that there's going to be a zoning change, and I'm privy to that, and therefore I want to buy that karka because I know after the zoning change it's going to be worth 10 times what it is, okay, I understand. But in Cain Ein L'Davar Sof, there's got to be some place where you can stop and say, okay, I can ascertain this. It's public. I should do my homework and know what's going on with that karka. But somehow with metaltalin, you can't say the same thing, because it's fungible. There's too much going on in the private domain with metaltalin. Again, I think we understand what we're saying, that there is a difference between karka and metaltalin. Therefore, with karka, we can more easily say that you're not going to fall afoul to that, because you'll do some homework, or you should do some homework. But metaltalin, we can't fault you for not knowing, because there's so much to know. So therefore, the klal, the marketplace has to protect you. Okay, so now we've established this machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. So let's look at the pasuk. Rashi says, "Nichtav kisibku mimchar miyad amisecha al tonu my okana." What is the word okana? Lahachi kisiva lemasmach kinyan lemiyad lomer she'ein nikna ad sheyotze miyad zeh liyad zeh. So again, by using that word, okana, we're saying that it's not complete until it moves from one hand to the other, which is Mashiach. That's Mashiach, that you have to move from one hand to the other. That's how we learned that pasuk. Okay. So so fine. The next Rashi will go weiter. So now we have an understanding of why Rish Lakish doesn't hold like Rabbi Yochanan. Now, frek the Gemara of Rabbi Yochanan, oikona my ovidle. Now we're going to bounce back to Rabbi Yochanan. We understood Rabbi Yochanan that he was lemute karka, okona miad ovidle. What are you going to do with the word kana? Because Rish Lakish's theory is correct. Okana is coming to tell us Mashiach. So how are you going to answer what the word Okana comes to tell us? So says the Gemara, Maboyel in the Kedetanya. Rabbi Yochanan is going to tell you, you know what? I need this word Okana for a different reason. Because we learned in a Mishnah, what does the Mishnah say? The Brisa. What does the Brisa say? He quotes that pasuk. Mimkar altonu. Right? It says that if you sell something, that you shouldn't commit fraud. You shouldn't do something improper. Ainli ela shidus analokeach. So from the lashon of the pasuk, I would only know that where the seller is defrauding the buyer, altonu. We can't do it. Nisana mocher minayin. This is Rabbi Yochanan's point. How do I know that it's reciprocal? How do I know that if the buyer is underpaying to the seller, that that's not okay? Maybe it's okay. It's only okay. It's not okay for a seller to overcharge a buyer, but how do I know reciprocally that it's not okay for a buyer to underpay the seller? Maybe we're going to say, seller beware. You're making the sale. Do your homework. Okay, don't cheat the buyer, but know your product. Therefore, if the buyer makes an offer and you're willing to accept it, and it's more than a sixth, maybe that's okay. But seller beware.
Isn't there some calculus we can apply to when you think you've gotten a ganze Metzia, that it's actually Geneva? Isn't there some kind of calculus we can apply in terms of percentage or something? It's way in the back, recesses my mind. I remember vaguely that, but I don't remember the particulars. Does that ring a bell?
That's what we've been talking about. That's 1/6.
No, that's the sixth. That's
the sixth. Okay, it was the sixth.
I know that we're talking about that 1/6 is enough to push it into the negative category and say that you're not dealing fairly in halacha. Again, this is halacha. In the secular world, if you make a deal and you make a windfall, no one's going to say you committed fraud. Well, I shouldn't say that, because former President Trump is under indictment because he oversold the value of his property, which, by the way, it's a complicated thing to really comprehend, is because I'm allowed to say my house is worth $1 million. You want to pay me only 600? That's your problem. My house is worth $1 million. It's subjective. So now is going to come someone else, a court, or someone's going to sell. You defrauded by saying that your house is worth $1 million. And I'm going to say, maybe to someone it's worth $1 million. I would pay $1 million if I were buying this property. This makes it so difficult to put your finger on this. That's what I'm trying to point out, is if once you deal with valuations that is so highly subjective, unless 1 million people in the world are going to say, no way this property can be worth $1 million. Okay, I'll give you another example. I get these emails from a company called Redfin. I'm on their list somehow. So every Montag and Donnerstag, I get an email. Do you know how much your property is worth in Kemp Mill? So I disregard it. One day I get a thing and I say, your property is worth between so and so. And I say to myself, really? Last week it was under that number. Today it's skyrocketed to that number. So I'm curious enough to click on, which is not something I should do. I click on and I take a look at the Narishkeit and I say to myself, okay, fine. But wait a minute. This is a third-party purveyor who has some credibility in the marketplace and is telling me that my property is now worth this. So I'll go out in the market and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to sell it for $750,000. 2 days ago, you wouldn't pay me more than $500,000. But wait a minute. So in other words, these things are totally, it's somewhat irrelevant. Again, it's a guideline, but what happens? So it's very puzzling. It's very puzzling how you can pursue when it comes to valuations.
But Rabbi, I gotta say, we learned previously. I mean, we have there could be individual reasons why someone charges a higher price or the buyer or sells at a lower price.
Right.
And what the market says is not necessarily the market. There are other things, the liquidity of either the buyer or the seller, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't understand. We've learned before that the buyer beware and that the seller has to know what's going on there. So how can we attribute this? I mean, between two solid, reasonable thinking people who are conducting a transfer, why do we have to, we also have a commandment, thou shalt not steal. So we understand that you're solidified. Why do we have to go through all this to pull all this shtick?
Well, for one, okay, so we're talking about metaltalin, right? Not karka. In other words,
I understand even more so.
Okay, so we're talking about metaltalin. So now the question, the Gemara, since remember, in our world, in the Torah world, everything derives from the Torah. So you can theorize, and you're 100% right in saying to people they should be honorable, they should do the right thing. So what? We're going to say that the buyer and seller have to do all the research in advance before they make a deal so that they know what they're buying and selling. Okay, I give you that in a perfect situation, that's what should happen. Do your homework, know that the market for this is X and Y, and then you go ahead and sell it. Therefore, you won't be over in any kind of a no situation, because you're going to be able to hang your hat on the fact that the market tells me that's what it is. I didn't go cheat anybody. I know that there is a market for this, and here's the way I prove it. Comes the Torah, and the Torah says, you know what? We're not going to rely on your judgment. We're not going to say what you think, what I think, what he thinks. We're going to look at rock solid information. Now, rock solid information tells us that this should be the price, within a little bit of a margin, I give you. But more than that margin, no. So now, if the pasuk, but again, if the words of the pasuk say, and I'm going to give you quote it, this honor that Elo Elisha, this honor lokech, we see simchro, we see simkru mimkar. If it were to say, when a person sells to a buyer, altonu, don't cheat him, then you can't extrapolate without understanding that that is just a one-way street. The mocher can't cheat the lokeach, because it says simkar mimkar, altonu, don't cheat him. The pasuk doesn't stop there, though. The pasuk says simkar mimkar, right? It says you should not cheat him, or you shouldn't buy from your fellow man. So now it's not only going out, it's also coming in. What does that mean, coming in? So now Rabbi Yochanan says that it doesn't come to tell us Mashiach like Resh Lakish. We need that pasuk, because if we didn't have the pasuk, which we rely on, how would I know that a buyer can't cheat a seller? Now you're going to say the halacha, al pi seichel, everything else, but we're hanging our hat on a pasuk. We're hanging our hat on what the Torah tells us. If the Torah only tells us that the buyer beware, then, and it doesn't say seller beware, then the buyer can cheat the seller, because the seller, it's fair game. Comes the pasuk and says oikana, that the okana means that the buyer, if he knows something and the seller doesn't, that he can't cheat him and say, okay, I got you. That again, if there is a sixth, if there's an oino here, even by karka, then he has to pay the difference. So,
but Rabbi, you know, what troubles me about all this is the seller might be desperate, maybe in a situation where he
Right.
has to have money for whatever reason,
right,
whether he has a chance to buy something else, so he needs liquid assets to be able to purchase something else that he
Right.
thinks is going to be a Metzia. It doesn't really matter. So, you know, the admonition to each party that you need to be careful and you don't cheat them does not mean that the market price is necessarily indicative. I mean, it harkens me back to the 60s when we were collecting baseball cards, and we had, you know, there was a misprint on a sheet of cards, and you know,
it's
not the same.
Right.
It's not the same, you know, it's less, it's not that. And people found, oh my God, there's a misprint on a Mickey Mantle card, you know, it's worth 100 times more, even though the general price is X. So there are nuances to all.
Right.
And another example that comes to mind, I think of this a lot, is a bottle of water. You could have the bottle of water you buy from Costco in a big package. It's 10 cents a bottle. You buy it in front of Costco, one at a time, refrigerated, it's $0.25 a bottle. You buy that same refrigerated bottle from a convenience store and it's $1, and you buy that same refrigerated bottle from at an airport or a stadium, and it's $5, or a restaurant, $5. And it's the exact same item, and everybody knows it's the exact same item, but there's an understanding in the marketplace that in certain places you can and do charge more.
Which is not, and that's not a no. That's not a no, for the same reason that you just say, that I'm providing a convenience either by putting it in a refrigerator so you don't have to, you can have a cold bottle of drink as opposed to a 24 pack of water, which isn't cold, or you're going to a particular place. So I have to truck it over there. I have an expense. I have to house it, et cetera, et cetera. For that, I have to charge. Therefore, in those kinds of circumstances, there is no ono because you filter you filter it through.
Why not? Why not? I mean, market price is X. So let's say your cost, even with all that, is $1 and you're selling it for $5. Is that, isn't that overkill? Isn't that taking advantage?
So Michael, if I'm a businessman and I set up a stand as someone is going into a park or into a place where there will be no opportunity to buy water or food, and I say the last stop before the desert, whatever, and I'm going to charge $10 a bottle for that water, and are you kidding me? $10? I'll say, so don't buy it. Okay, go in without it. So then now you're basically okay. So there may be some. There may be, and again, this is a shaila, right? Whether or not someone is taking advantage of a situation, and therefore he shouldn't be allowed to do that. But hakol lefi makam, hakol lefi zman. It's all about the time and the place. If you're in a place where there is no other opportunity, if I have to bring that water from a long distance to be able to bring it here to sell it to you, again, this is the machlokes. Am I entitled to my tircha? And what's my tircha worth? If my tircha is worth a 20%, 50% appreciation, 100%, whatever it is, this is the nuance, Michael, that we can't be absolutely put our finger on and say, this is I know and this
But
is
that's
I know.
exactly the point that the Torah needs to understand. If I need something right away and you're selling it to me, and you're overcharging me. In fact, you're gouging me, but I need it right away. I need that specific thing right away. There's a value there. And so
right.
Why are you entering into a free market situation?
Right. So this is where we have Baruch Hashem Shulchan Aruch. Again, what's in the Torah is black letter law. Now comes the Rabbanon, and they say, okay, between Mekach and Memker in commerce, there has to be some balance. In other words, somebody should be entitled to his yigia, to his sweat, to do it sweat, and the other person should not be entitled. What that line is, I'm not going to tell you here today, Michael, what it is that we're crossing. 10%, 100%.
I've seen the line crossed. We've seen it in our own communities in our own lifetime. But the point is that, I understand that the mission of the Torah and the Talmud is to protect both parties.
Yes.
But they can only go so far to do that. And to inject, to say, this is the market price, and if you charge a sixth over the market price, which is an average price, obviously there's a range. So, you gouge above that range, quote unquote, that you have to pay an additional six. That's subjective. It's judgmental.
Right. Right.
So I don't know how you put an independent qualifier to gauge. Yes, you can say certain things are absolutely outlandish, but there may be a reason why the buyer had to have that at that time.
Yeah. So the best answer I can give you, because I don't have a definitive answer to your question. You're right. So this is why, in a circumstance where there is this imbalance, you go to a Bezdin or court, you go to Bezdin and say, Bezdin, look, this is worth $1 by any stretch of the imagination. I understand that where I bought it, that dollar should be 5 times what it is, but not 15 times. That's where the Bezdin now has to use its judgment to say that, you know what, we can penalize him for ono, or it's an open market, and therefore anybody can step in, and therefore you're not mechuyev to buy it. I mean, again, if you're thirsty, of course you have to drink, but we're not putting a gun to your head and saying you must buy this and buy it at 15 times its price. So I think.
But Rabbi, let me wait.
Michael, you have a very valid point, but this becomes a very subjective thing.
The Beis Din, either party has the right to go to a Beis Din and pursue this.
Right.
The Beis Din isn't aggressively coming and saying, no, you can't make that sale that way. So that's a right to evaluate that.
Yeah.
But, with all this guidance, it's still between the buyer and the seller. So
Right.
that you have that right to take it to Beis Din is your protection. So you can give guidance, but then you can't get in the middle. If the Beis Din evaluates and says that it was gouging, then you pay the sixth. Okay. But, this is entering into commercial transactions as we've learned previously for the last 20 dafim or more. That's what merchandise selling and buying is about.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me do this. I'm going to look further into the Hilchos Oino again, because I don't have an expertise. I will look further in Hilchos Oino to see what, if any, limits, under what circumstances, or are there circumstances where Oino can never apply because it's truly an open market? I mean, it's a fair question. Our question today that we just answered, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is that there is such a thing as oino reciprocally. That's where we were getting at. In other words, our question was, from the pasuk, I would think that a seller cannot cheat a buyer, but I have no reason to say that a buyer should be circumscribed to cheat a seller because the seller said no. Says the pasuk, oikana, the words okana, meaning that it changes hands, outgoing and incoming, that we're protecting the seller, who, by the way, initiates all this. He's the one who set the price. So if he set the price, and then the buyer came along and underpaid him, and he said, "Okay, I'll take it," that we're protecting him against himself, that he should be at least compensated for. No, that's the focus of our pasuk, of our Gemara. Your question is well taken, and then the question now is, how far does Ono go, and under what circumstance? So, Belinetta, I will look at that, and so we'll be able to discuss that more next week. But just to finish up, because we're running here, so the kasha, according to Rabbi Yochanan, was, what does he do? Why does he not hold that Mashiach is kaina? He says, because we need it to protect the seller, that the buyer shouldn't underpay him. Now, one more piece, the Rish Lakish. But what does Rish Lakish do with this? Rish Lakish says we use it for Mashiach. How does Rish Lakish know that we protect the seller from underpayment by the buyer? And for the Gemara, Tarta Gama Minei. This is a kind of a fallback answer that we've seen in the Gemara again. I just want to point it out. So Rish Lakish says we learn two things out from the same pasuk. Now, normally, every pasuk tells us something specific. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, Okana tells us that a buyer cannot underpay the seller. But wait a minute. So since that very pasuk is what Rish Lakish uses for Mashiach, what does he do for the underpayment portion? And for the Gemara, Tarta Gamale, he learns both of them out, both Mashiach and underpayment. Take a look at Rashi. So Rashi tells us, Tarta Gamamine, Oinos Moicher Miakana, Altonu u'mishicha minimus samach miad loshen kinyan lo samchel memker. So Rashi is telling us that according to Rish Lakish, Tarta Gomamine, that you learn both oina'ah, the principle of oina'ah, and the principle of mishicha. That's what he says. Oina'ah moicha ma'ikana altonu u'mishicha minimus samach miad loshen kinyan lo samchel lemek. Since the word Okana, it was at the end of the pasuk, right? And it was not next to the beginning where we were talking about the seller. Therefore, it's the positioning of the word that allows us to extrapolate and say that it refers to the buyer. In other words, I would say if the word altonu was in the beginning of the pasuk, I would say it only applies to the seller. But since it's at the end of the pasuk, then we have to, by definition, say it applies to both. You have one circumstance where the seller is taking advantage, one circumstance where the buyer is taking advantage. Altonu don't do either. that makes sense to say it that way. So according to Rish Lakish, we've now answered the kasha that he says that this pasuk teaches us both. Now we're going to continue a little bit next week along the same line by going back and forth and trying to understand Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish, but for our purposes today, we've sort of crystallized that Rabbi Yochanan, and it's going to become important next week to discuss this a little bit further, but Rabbi Yochanan holds midaraisa money is kona, but we have a rabbinic decree on Mashicha, and according to Rish Lakish, no, Mashicha is midaraisa. The Mashicha is what the Torah requires. You can't use money as the barometer for the completion of a sale. You have to use Mashicha, and therefore, if you use Mashicha, then he answers, well, what about other things that we have to learn out from that pasuk? If you're hanging your hand on Mashicha, there are other things to learn out. So understand that in Rish Lakish, he's a little bit more liberal and broader in his interpretation and saying the pasuk can encompass more than one chiddush. Rabbi Yochanan says the pasuk tells us this chiddush, and Rish Lakish says, no, it tells us two chidushim. And that, again, is a interesting dichotomy in the Gemara, that we see this from time to time, is that some of our commentaries, whether it's a Maroim who are interpreting the Mishnah, interpret it more, well, I'll call it liberally, meaning that they're more open to understanding the Mishnah in a way that others are more restrictive. So those who are restrictive say you can only learn one chiddush from that particular pasuk, and others say no, you can learn more than one chiddush from a pasuk, and that's basically the underpinning of the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, is how you interpret the psukim. As to your point, Michael, which is very well taken, the halacha of Oinah, since we're holding in it, we should really understand it a little bit better. What are the parameters of Oinah, and how far down the road can you go before you say this is Oinah? And that's something that Mitcham will try to pick up next week. All right, so everyone have a good week, and let's hope Taka Klal Yisrael. We're on Shpilkis, all of us. What's going to happen here? And no one knows. Rabban Shalom has to direct us. So hopefully we'll have a successful week, and it'll be Shalom, and Klal Yisrael won't incur any further damage. But we'll do what we have to do. So everyone have a wonderful week.